Imagine a leader who never lost a war against the United States Army, the only Native American commander in history who can make that claim. Imagine a strategist so brilliant that he orchestrated coordinated attacks across hundreds of miles of rugged territory, tying down thousands of federal troops with forces never exceeding a few thousand warriors, and ultimately forcing the most powerful nation on the continent to sue for peace on his terms. Imagine a man who rose from an unpromising childhood as an orphan to become the most feared and respected Indian leader of his generation, who outmaneuvered generals like William Tecumseh Sherman, and who, even in defeat, continued to fight for his people's rights with the same fierce determination he had shown on the battlefield. This was Red Cloud, Mahpiya Luta, the Oglala Lakota chief who stands alone in American history as the master of guerrilla warfare and the man who closed the Bozeman Trail forever. The name itself was a prophecy. Red Cloud was reportedly named for a red meteor that streaked across the sky on the night of his birth around 1821, a celestial fireball that the elders interpreted as a sign of great things to come. He was born along Blue Creek, a tributary of the North Platte River in what is now Nebraska, though some sources place his birth on the Smoky Hill River in Kansas. His mother walks as she thinks, was Oglala. His father, Lone Man, was Brule, but both died when he was young, his father succumbing to alcoholism when Red Cloud was only 3 or 4 years old, leaving him an orphan in a culture where family connections meant everything. He was raised by his uncle, Old Chief Smoke, a prominent leader of the Oglala division of the Lakota, but as an orphan with no hereditary title. He commanded little respect and knew from the earliest age that he would have to prove himself through his own actions. He threw himself into this task with a determination that would characterize his entire life. He worked tirelessly to hone his skills in sports, horsemanship, and hunting, mastering the arts that would make him a successful warrior. At around 16, he participated in his first battle against the Crow, traditional enemies of the Lakota who contested control of the prime hunting grounds of the Powder River country. In that engagement, young Red Cloud performed an act that would define his reputation. He rode ahead of his companions, charged directly at the enemy, and touched several of them with his bow, an act known as counting coup, before escaping unharmed. In Lakota warfare, counting coup was considered a greater honor than simply killing an enemy. It demonstrated supreme courage, the ability to get close enough to touch a living, fighting adversary and then withdraw without injury. By the time he was 21, through his bravery and success in battle, Red Cloud had become a prominent war leader, one of the most famous warriors on the northern prairies. A controversial incident early in his life shaped the political landscape of the Oglala for decades. In November 1841, a long-simmering rivalry between two factions of Oglala bands, those loyal to Chief Bull Bear and those loyal to Red Cloud's uncle, Old Chief Smoke, erupted in violence. During a dispute, Red Cloud killed Bull Bear. Some accounts suggest this was a calculated act to assume the older man's status, but at the time Red Cloud was a young warrior, not yet 20. Hardly old enough to have won widespread recognition as a band chief. The death of the influential Bull Bear instead generated an unprecedented schism in Oglala society, dividing the people into two major divisions, the Tecumseh band under Bull Bear's supporters to the south, and the Bad Faces band under Smoke's supporters, including Red Cloud, to the north. This division would have lasting consequences, but for Red Cloud, personally, It cleared the path for his eventual emergence as a leader. The mid-19th century brought enormous changes to the Great Plains. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had attempted to define territories for the various tribes, establishing peace among them and protecting the growing numbers of white settlers passing through on the Oregon Trail. Red Cloud attended this treaty council, and even then, as a young warrior, he spoke against the agreement, predicting that the Americans would ignore its terms and that the Indians would be made dependent on alcohol and government handouts. His words proved prophetic, but at the time, few listened to the young upstart. For the Lakota, the decades following the treaty were a period of expansion and conflict. The great buffalo herds that sustained their way of life were beginning to dwindle under pressure from white hunters and encroaching settlement. The Lakota began pushing westward into the Powder River country, territory that the 1851 treaty had assigned to the Crow Nation. Through a series of wars and raids, they drove the Crows out of the region, establishing their dominance over the hunting grounds along the Powder, Tongue, and Bighorn rivers. By 1860, the Lakota and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies had effectively conquered this territory, and they regarded it as their own, won through the sacrifice of their warriors. The discovery of gold in Montana Territory in 1863 changed everything. Prospectors and settlers needed a route to the gold fields, and frontiersman John Bozeman blazed a trail that cut directly through the heart of the Powder River hunting grounds. The Bozeman Trail branched off from the Oregon Trail near Fort Laramie and struck north through Wyoming, crossing the Powder River and its tributaries before reaching the Montana gold camps. It was the shortest and easiest route to the riches of Montana. And from 1864 to 1866, thousands of emigrants traversed it, competing with the Indians for the diminishing resources near the trail. To the Lakota, this was an invasion. The trail passed through their best hunting territory, driving away game and bringing settlers. The Powder River country, with its numerous rivers, was the last unspoiled hunting ground of the northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, as well as several bands of Lakota. Red Cloud watched this encroachment with growing alarm. He had allowed white emigrants to pass through Lakota land before, understanding that they were merely travelers heading elsewhere. But the Bozeman Trail was different. It was a permanent route, and worse, the United States government was preparing to build forts along it to protect the travelers. In 1865, the U.S. Army launched the Powder River Expedition under General Patrick Connor, a force of nearly 2,700 soldiers ordered to pacify the region. The expedition destroyed one Arapaho village and otherwise accomplished nothing except to further enrage the tribes. Connor's forces were unable to bring the mobile Lakota and Cheyenne warriors to battle, and the expedition withdrew in failure. Having demonstrated that conventional military tactics were useless against the guerrilla warfare of the Plains Indians, in the aftermath of this failure, the government attempted a different approach. In the fall of 1865, negotiators concluded treaties with various Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders, providing monetary compensation in exchange for safe passage along the overland routes. But the signatories to these treaties were Laramie loafers, Indians who lived near Fort Laramie and depended on government handouts. The real leaders of the hostile bands, especially Red Cloud, had never been consulted, and the treaties meant nothing to them. For a treaty to be effective, the Indians who had fought Connor, especially Red Cloud, had to be engaged. No white man could be found who was willing to undertake the dangerous mission of finding Red Cloud and bringing him to Fort Laramie, so several of the loafers volunteered. Remarkably, They succeeded, and on March 12, 1866, Red Cloud and his Oglala rode into Fort Laramie. He agreed to remain peacefully until the government's chief negotiator arrived with presents for the assembled Indians. For 3 months, Red Cloud waited, expecting negotiations to begin. Then, in June 1866, with the worst possible timing, Colonel Henry Carrington arrived at the head of the 18th Infantry, nearly 1,300 soldiers with wagons loaded with construction supplies. He had orders to march into the Powder River country and establish forts along the Bozeman Trail, creating a permanent military presence in the heart of Lakota territory. When Red Cloud realized what was happening, his reaction was immediate and furious. The Americans had been negotiating with him for months, while simultaneously dispatching an army to invade his land. At the formal treaty proceedings, with Colonel Carrington's troops visible in the distance, Red Cloud rose from the council, pointed at the soldiers, and declared that the only treaty he would accept was one written on the bones of the soldiers who dared to enter his country. According to some accounts, he specifically warned that he would kill every white man who went beyond Crazy Woman's Fork of the Powder River. Then, with several chiefs, he led approximately 1,000 warriors out of the council and rode north to prepare for war. Red Cloud immediately began calling together a war council. His vision extended beyond his own Oglala band. He understood that the only hope of resisting the Americans lay in unity. He sent messengers to the Cheyenne, to the Arapaho, to the various Lakota bands scattered across the northern plains. By late summer, he had assembled perhaps 2,000 warriors, a force drawn from multiple tribes and bands, all united under his leadership for the purpose of driving the Americans from the Powder River country. The U.S. Army, by contrast, had about 700 soldiers and 300 civilians scattered among 3 forts that Carrington was constructing along the Bozeman Trail. Fort Reno to the south, Fort Phil Kearny in the middle, and Fort C.F. Smith to the north. The strategy Red Cloud devised was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. He could not defeat the U.S. Army in a pitched battle. His warriors, for all their courage and skill, lacked the numbers and firepower to assault fortified positions defended by cannon and disciplined infantry. But he did not need to defeat the army in a single engagement. He needed to make the occupation so costly, so harrowing, so demoralizing that the American public would demand withdrawal. He did this by striking constantly and unpredictably. Throughout the summer and fall of 1866, while Fort Phil Kearny was under construction, Carrington suffered about 50 Indian attacks, losing more than 20 soldiers and civilians. Small war parties would attack woodcutting details outside the forts, killing a few soldiers and then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Others would raid wagon trains on the Bozeman Trail, burning supplies and running off livestock. Some would stampede horse herds, stealing cavalry mounts and leaving the soldiers afoot. The attacks came at any hour, in any weather, at any point along the hundreds of miles of trail and around each of the 3 forts. Red Cloud coordinated these strikes with remarkable precision, able to send a force against Fort Phil Kearny and simultaneously threaten Fort C.F. Smith 90 miles away, keeping the garrisons off balance and terrified. Colonel Carrington, the American commander, was a bureaucrat and engineer with no experience fighting Indians. He had been chosen for the post because of his administrative skills, not his combat record, and his caution infuriated younger officers who had served with distinction in the Civil War. Among them was Captain William Fetterman, a veteran who had distinguished himself in battle between 1861 and 1865, and who arrived at Fort Phil Kearny in November 1866. Fetterman had nothing but contempt for Carrington's defensive posture, and even less for the Indian warriors he had never faced. He allegedly boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the whole Sioux nation. This boast would prove prophetic in the worst possible way. Red Cloud, through scouts and informants, was well aware of the tensions within the fort. He knew that Fetterman was rash, that he despised his commander, and that he could be provoked into making a mistake. He also knew that a successful blow against the soldiers would demoralize the army and boost the confidence of his warriors. And so, in December 1866, he laid a trap that would become the most famous engagement of his war. The Indians, possibly numbering more than 1,000 warriors, congregated about 10 miles north of Fort Phil Kearny. They reconnoitered the area and decided the best place to lay the ambush was along the Bozeman Trail, north of Lodge Trail Ridge, a rise about 4 miles from the fort, out of sight of the garrison. The Cheyenne and Arapaho took up positions on the west side of the trail, the Lakota on the east. The group of warriors chosen to decoy the soldiers into the trap included the young Oglala war leader, Crazy Horse, already gaining a reputation for courage and daring. The morning of December 21st, 1866, dawned clear and cold. About 10 o'clock, Carrington's pickets on Pilot Hill signaled that the wagon train sent to the timber camp about 5 miles northwest was under attack. Carrington ordered a relief party composed of 49 infantrymen and 27 mounted troopers under the command of Captain James Powell. By claiming seniority as a brevet lieutenant colonel, Fetterman demanded and was given command of the relief party. Captain Frederick Brown, the post quartermaster and another of Carrington's critics, joined him, along with 2 civilian volunteers, bringing the force up to exactly 81 officers and men. Before they departed, Carrington gave explicit orders. Under no circumstances was the relief party to pursue over Lodge Trail Ridge. Lieutenant Grumman's wife, in her memoirs, confirmed that Carrington gave these orders twice, the second time from the sentry walk after ordering the soldiers to halt as they left the front gate of the fort. Everyone present could hear him. On leaving the fort, however, Fetterman took the Lodge Trail Ridge Road northward rather than the trail northwest toward the timber camp. Carrington, watching from the fort, assumed he intended to approach the Indians attacking the wood train from their rear. Within a short time, the signal came that the wood train was no longer under attack. A group of about 50 Indians appeared near the fort, but Carrington dispersed them with a few cannon shots. Those Indians and others harassed Fetterman as he climbed Lodge Trail Ridge and disappeared out of sight of the fort. About noon, Carrington and his men heard heavy firing to the north. He hastily gathered about 75 men under Captain Ten Eyck and sent them out to search for Fetterman. Ten Eyck advanced carefully up Lodge Trail Ridge. Reaching the top, about 12:45 p.m., he and his men saw a very large force of Indians in the Pennow Creek Valley below. Indian warriors approached the soldiers and taunted them. The firing had ceased. Ten Eyck could see figures on the battlefield, but they were too far away to identify. What had happened was a textbook example of Red Cloud's tactical brilliance. The decoy party, led by Crazy Horse, had appeared on the ridge ahead of Fetterman's column. They whooped and gestured, daring the soldiers to chase them. Fetterman, ignoring Carrington's explicit orders, took the bait and led his command over Lodge Trail Ridge and out of sight of the fort. Behind that ridge, hidden in the ravines and draws, waited the massed warriors. As Fetterman's men crested the ridge and pursued the decoys down the far slope, the trap was sprung. Warriors erupted from every direction, cutting off the soldiers' retreat and surrounding them completely. The battle lasted perhaps 30 minutes to an hour. Fetterman's men fought desperately, but they were outnumbered more than 10 to 1 and facing warriors who had trained their whole lives for this kind of combat. The Indians used their mobility and knowledge of the terrain to surround the soldiers and cut them down. When it was over, all 81 soldiers and civilians lay dead, the worst military defeat the U.S. Army had suffered on the Great Plains to that time, a disaster that would not be exceeded until Custer's fall at the Little Bighorn 10 years later. The Lakota called it the Battle of the 100 in the Hands, a reference to the 81 soldiers who had been delivered into their power. The Americans called it the Fetterman Massacre. But whatever name it went by, the message was unmistakable. Red Cloud had drawn first blood, and he had drawn it spectacularly. The victory sent shockwaves through the Army and the American public. Carrington was relieved of command, replaced by more aggressive officers who promised to punish the Indians. But the new commanders fared no better. Throughout 1867, Red Cloud continued his campaign of harassment, attacking wagon trains, woodcutting details, and haying parties with relentless efficiency. In August 1867, the Indians launched 2 major assaults. On August the 1st, they attacked a hay-cutting party near Fort C.F. Smith in what became known as the Hayfield Fight. On August 2nd, a similar engagement occurred near Fort Phil Kearny, the Wagon Box Fight. In this battle, woodcutters and soldiers had formed a corral about 6 miles west of the fort, using the heavy wooden boxes from their wagons to create a primitive enclosure. They had recently been issued new breech-loading rifles capable of firing several rounds per minute, far superior to the old muzzle loaders. At dawn, a large force of Indians attacked. The soldiers rushed to the corral and held off repeated assaults throughout the morning and into the afternoon. When a howitzer from the fort announced the approach of reinforcements, the Indians finally withdrew, having sustained heavy casualties while inflicting far fewer in return. These fights were tactical defeats for Red Cloud, demonstrating that improved American weaponry could offset the Indians' numerical superiority, but strategically they had the opposite effect. The Army realized that even with superior weapons, protecting the Bozeman Trail was costing far more than it was worth. The trail had been closed to civilian traffic for months. The forts were under constant siege, casualties were mounting, and there was no end in sight. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the region's new commander, estimated that defeating the Indians would require 20,000 soldiers, more than the army could spare. In the fall of 1867, the government made the first overtures for peace. A commission invited Red Cloud to negotiations at Fort Laramie, but he refused even to attend until the forts were abandoned. The government, recognizing that it had no choice, finally agreed. In the spring of 1868, orders went out to evacuate the 3 posts along the Bozeman Trail. In August 1868, the last soldiers marched out and the Indians immediately burned the forts to the ground. Red Cloud had won. He was the only Native American leader in history to defeat the United States in a war, forcing the government to abandon its forts, close its trail, and sue for peace on his terms. It was an achievement unmatched before or since, and it made his name legendary across the plains. On November 6, 1868, Red Cloud and other Lakota leaders signed the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, formally ending the war. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, encompassing all of modern South Dakota west of the Missouri River, along with parts of North Dakota and Nebraska. It designated the Black Hills as part of the reservation, reserved for the exclusive use of the Sioux forever. It also established the Powder River country as unceded Indian territory, where the Lakota could continue to hunt as long as the buffalo lasted. In 1871, as stipulated in the treaty, the U.S. government established the Red Cloud Agency for the Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho near Fort Laramie. 2 years later, the agency was moved to northwestern Nebraska, near the present town of Crawford, on a hill overlooking the White River. There, the agency became the center of much activity and, eventually, the site where Red Cloud's rival and fellow war leader Crazy Horse would surrender in May 1877. Red Cloud had achieved everything he had fought for. The Bozeman Trail was closed, the forts were gone, and his people's land was guaranteed by treaty. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Lakota might actually be able to preserve their way of life against the relentless tide of American expansion. But the peace did not last. Many of Red Cloud's followers scorned his accommodation with the white man and refused to make peace with the government. They left the agency to pursue the war, continuing to resist American encroachment. In 1874, an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer entered the Black Hills and discovered gold. When news of the discovery reached the east, it triggered a gold rush that overwhelmed all treaty obligations. Thousands of miners flooded into the sacred hills, and the government, instead of expelling them as the treaty required, attempted to negotiate a new agreement that would transfer the Black Hills to the United States. Red Cloud refused to sell. He traveled to Washington, D.C., to meet with government officials, arguing passionately that the Black Hills had been guaranteed to his people forever and that the treaty must be honored. But his words fell on deaf ears. The government, pressured by mining interests and westward expansion, decided to force the issue. In 1875, federal negotiators attempted to persuade the Sioux to sell the Black Hills and failed. The following year, tensions erupted into another full-scale war, the Great Sioux War of 1876. 1877. This time, Red Cloud did not join the fighting. He had given his word in the 1868 treaty, and he believed that further resistance was futile. He watched from the reservation as his former protege Crazy Horse and the other war leaders gathered in the Powder River country. As they fought and defeated Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876, but he refused to join them. The government, suspicious of his loyalty despite his peaceful stance, ordered his arrest and disarmament. In October 1876, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie surrounded Red Cloud's camp and confiscated all his horses and weapons. His influence, already diminished by his decision to remain at peace, was deliberately broken. The following year, Crazy Horse was killed at Fort Robinson under disputed circumstances, and the last resistance collapsed. In the fall of 1877, Red Cloud and his people were moved to the Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota, where they would remain for the rest of his life. Pine Ridge, established in 1878 as successor to the Red Cloud Agency, became the home of the Oglala Sioux, a vast reservation of prairie land that remains their sovereign territory to this day. For the next 3 decades, Red Cloud continued to fight, but with different weapons. He became a statesman and diplomat, traveling repeatedly to Washington to advocate for his people's rights. He opposed the Dawes Act of 1887, which broke up tribal lands into individual allotments and opened surplus territory to white settlement. He resisted government efforts to suppress Lakota culture and religion. He spoke out against corruption and mismanagement at the Indian agencies. In April 1897, he paid the last of several personal visits to Washington. appearing before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to oppose the policy of land allotment. Although the government no longer considered him an influential chief, his kinsfolk, including many of his former detractors, had grown to respect him for his devotion to protecting Oglala land. The ghost dance movement swept through the reservations in 1890, promising the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of the whites. Red Cloud did not join it, believing that it would only lead to more bloodshed. When the movement culminated in the massacre at Wounded Knee on December 29, 1890, less than 30 miles from Pine Ridge, where the 7th Cavalry killed more than 300 Lakota men, women, and children, his caution was vindicated. Wounded Knee became the symbol of all the atrocities, broken treaties, and injustices done to Native Americans, and its shadow fell across Red Cloud's final years. In his final years, despite his long resistance to cultural change, Red Cloud converted to Catholicism, and he and his wife were baptized a few years before his death. He died on December 10, 1909. At the Pine Ridge Agency at the age of 87. He was buried at Holy Rosary Mission Cemetery with the full rites of the Catholic Church, having incorporated some of its teachings into traditional Lakota beliefs. He had outlived all the other great Lakota war leaders, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Gall. All were gone. Red Cloud alone had survived, living long enough to see his people confined to reservations, their lands taken, their way of life destroyed. But he had also lived long enough to see something else, a legacy that would endure beyond his death. His children and grandchildren carried on his name and his values. His great-grandson, Oliver Red Cloud, served as the traditional chief of the Pine Ridge Reservation from 1979 until his death in 2013, fighting for the honoring of treaties and the return of the Black Hills. The Red Cloud School and Heritage Center in South Dakota, established in his honor, continues to educate Lakota children, reinforcing traditional identity. The legal battle over the Black Hills continues to this day. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the Black Hills had been taken illegally in violation of the Fifth Amendment and that the tribe was owed compensation of more than $100 million. The Lakota have refused to accept the money, insisting that they want the land itself, not payment for it. As of 22/6, the funds with interest exceed $1 billion, still held in trust, still unaccepted. Red Cloud's greatest achievement, victory in Red Cloud's war, stands alone in American history. No other Native American leader forced the United States to abandon its forts, close its roads, and sue for peace. It was a victory won not by superior numbers or technology, but by strategy, patience, and an unshakable will. Red Cloud understood that he could not destroy the American army, but he could make the cost of occupying his land so high that the Americans would eventually give up, and he was right. His methods were those of the guerrilla: constant harassment, ambush, the targeting of supply lines and isolated detachments, the avoidance of pitched battles unless the odds were overwhelmingly favorable. He used the terrain, the weather, and his warriors' mobility to negate the Americans' advantages in firepower and logistics. He kept his forces dispersed for most of the year, then concentrated them for major operations. He used decoys and feints to draw his enemies into traps. He understood, as few commanders on either side did, that war is ultimately a contest of wills, not just of weapons. Red Cloud was not simply a warrior, he was a statesman and visionary. He understood that the only hope for his people lay in unity. in setting aside tribal rivalries to face a common enemy. He built a coalition that included Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. He also understood that war and diplomacy were two sides of the same coin. He fought when fighting served his purpose, but he negotiated when negotiation could achieve what fighting could not. He traveled repeatedly to Washington, even in his old age, to advocate for his people's rights. He learned to use the white man's own system against him, petitioning Congress, meeting with presidents, and speaking to the press. The man who emerges from the historical record is complex, sometimes contradictory. He could be ruthless in war, ordering attacks that killed soldiers and civilians alike. He could be stubborn in negotiation, refusing to yield even when pressured by the full power of the United States government. He could be pragmatic, accepting reservation life when resistance became futile, yet continuing to fight through legal and political channels. But above all, he was a survivor of poverty, of war, of displacement, of everything the 19th century could throw at a Native American leader. Red Cloud was the master of guerrilla warfare, the strategist who defeated the United States Army, the only Native American leader who can claim that distinction. He was born in obscurity, an orphan with no prospects, and he rose through courage and skill to become one of the most famous Indians in American history. He fought to preserve his people's land and way of life, and when he could no longer fight with weapons, he fought with words. He lost his land, but he never lost his dignity, and he never stopped fighting for what he believed was right. In the end, Red Cloud was more than a warrior. He was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most powerful empire can be defeated if the defenders are determined enough, strategic enough, and willing to pay the price. He was the master of the Bozeman Trail, the victor of Red Cloud's war, the man who closed the road and burned the forts and forced the United States to sue for peace. And he was the elder statesman who, in the twilight of his life, continued to speak for his people, to demand justice, to remind the world that the Lakota were still there, still fighting, still enduring. When he died in 1909, the New York Times ran an obituary noting that he had been the greatest of the Sioux chiefs and that his name would live in history as one of the most remarkable men of his race. It was a fitting tribute, but it barely scratched the surface. Red Cloud was not merely remarkable, he was unique. He was the only one who won. And in that victory, he earned a place in history that no one can ever take away. Today, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where he lived his final years, his descendants carry on his legacy, facing challenges that would break lesser spirits, yet remaining strong in their identity as Oglala Lakota, the people of Red Cloud. They are his living monument, the proof that the spirit of resistance he embodied did not die with him, but continues, generation after generation, to endure.